This is episode 280 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined this week by two guests. The first is Rob Black. He's the president and CEO of the New Mexico Chamber of Commerce. And Ted Abernathy, he is the head of Economic Leadership, a consultancy firm that is based in North Carolina, but works nationwide and recently did a very extensive report on New Mexico and its economic outlook. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, and Rob, of course, New Mexico Chamber of Commerce. Well, first and foremost, you all changed your name, and I'd like to have you talk briefly about that. But you're the head over there, and you're knee deep in the legislative session. And you guys hired Ted to do some work for you, and his work is going to be the centerpiece of the conversation here. But Rob, why don't you talk a little bit about yourself and the Chamber of Commerce, and especially the name change that your organization underwent, and anything else you'd like us to know at this point about the Chamber and its work.
Absolutely, Paul, and thanks again for the opportunity. So I'm born and raised in New Mexico. I grew up down in Lee County in the Permian Basin. My dad was the superintendent of schools down there and a county commissioner. And so we grew up there, went to UNM. But I've been away from the state for a while, about 20 something years, and had the opportunity to come home and take on this role as, at the time, the head of Association of Commerce and Industry, ACI. And ACI had been around 60 plus years in the state, one of the older business associations in the state, especially statewide. And but the board last year decided it was time to rebrand so that folks really had an easier time understanding of who we were and what we did. So late last year, the organization changed its name to the New Mexico Chamber of Commerce. We still have the same mission, which is to really look to improve the business climate, improve the quality of life, standard of living for New Mexicans and for the business community across the state. So that's our focus. As part of that, we are the business advocates, kind of the voice of business in Santa Fe. So yeah, we have been very involved in this legislative session. There's been some things that have been helpful that have come through with SB 1, SB 2, House Bill 11, looking to help with recovery. But there's a lot of very, very challenging bills that we've been spending a lot of time on, whether it's paid sick leave or a variety of different measures that create legal liabilities for businesses in the state. So we've been very active this session on those issues. But I think the main piece for today's conversation was looking at how can we start to grow the economy in New Mexico, and how do we position ourselves to really diversify for sustainable growth for the long term. And as we went into the COVID crisis, we decided we needed to move quickly. We had looked at doing a longer term, year-long strategy document that was business driven for the state around economic competitiveness, but we felt we needed to move very quickly. So we ended up reaching out to Ted. I got to know him through colleagues of mine who are in the State Chamber of Commerce Executives Association, and they recommended his work. And so we were able to contract with Ted to help in June to help build out this strategy document called Driving New Mexico's Future. And as part of that, we did both qualitative and quantitative research around the state. We did 7 focus groups, surveyed about 700 business leaders to really understand where their perspective was about where the state is today, and then really worked with Ted to figure out where the state needs to go to become more competitive. So that's a big part of what we've been doing over the last 6 or 7 months, is really building out this report. And now, and I think over the next couple of years, our goal will be to then implement the strategies that we've developed coming out of the report.
All right. And I found out about Ted and attended, and I used that air quote thing, the virtual University of New Mexico Business and Economics Summit, which took place right before the session got kicked off. And Ted, I want to turn the conversation to you a little bit. You gave what I thought was a very interesting and informative presentation at that meeting. Is that your kind of main product here as we move forward, or what is kind of the goal that you have or that you're working with here to spread your information? Are you having meetings with legislators? Did you do that in advance? What's the forward-looking progress with this report?
Well, I'll let Rob carry all the heavy water on what happens after the report is released, because he's the one that gets to work with legislators every day. But our goal going in was to do two things. It was to look at data, and we can talk a little bit about why data is so important, but then to also, as Rob said, talk to businesses in New Mexico. And we tried real hard to reach out to as many businesses as we could. Our work around the country looks at how states compare to each other economically and how competitive they are. And we're working in about a dozen states right now. We act as the economic policy advisor for the Council of State Chambers, which Rob's a member of, New Mexico State Chamber is a member of, and look at how they compare with each other. So our goal was to try to look at how New Mexico was doing and what in the data might suggest how they could do better. So that's how the report was framed. Rob wanted to add a big piece of engagement into that. So we talked to focus groups around different areas, talked to businesses through the survey and try to get their ideas. And then looked at, given what we saw, what were the best practices around the country that might make it better. And unfortunately for all of us, competitiveness is just it's not a destination, it's a journey, because everybody around you is changing all the time too. So this was starting by putting a flag in the ground. Here's where we stand. Here are the areas we need to do better at. And here are some ideas on how we can do better. And then it's up to Rob and his team to decide what they like of those ideas, which ones they can talk to legislators and the governor's office about, which ones can move forward, and then keep doing it so that they can continue to find new ways to be competitive moving forward.
Okay, well, very, very good. Rob, before I move on with more questions for Ted, is this something that you have had conversations about with legislators? Have you shared this information? And as a more practical, issue, this information is available in a PDF document that I was able to request. Is this something that you are posting online, planning to post online? Would it be okay if I posted online? So kind of some pretty practical stuff there in terms of disseminating Ted's information before we really get into the nuts and bolts here.
Absolutely, Paul. We'd love for you to post it online. And it is on our website at nmchamber.org.
Okay.
So it is available to anyone, and we are actively trying to get it into as many hands as possible. In drafting the strategy, we worked with a working group that included 3 cabinet secretaries, UNM, New Mexico State, New Mexico Partnership, AE, Albuquerque Economic Development Organization, and businesses across the state, and we even had labor involved. So it was a very broad group that was working to build this report. So that's one thing I want to kind of stress, is that we have engaged the administration and others throughout in the development so that they would have a stake in the outcome. And in fact, we're working with the Economic Development Department because the state now is in the process of drafting their statewide 20-year plan. And our strategy will have will be part of their overall strategy that they released in June as well. So again, trying to integrate our findings into the state-sponsored approach. We had sent this to every legislator. We did that in December. So every legislator received a copy of it, hard copy, as well as digital. We've done briefings with a variety of cabinet or cabinet secretaries, the governor's team, as well as with legislators and leadership there. So we've done individual briefings and larger briefings. Ted and I actually spoke to an interim committee in November with preliminary results for, that was the Economic and Rural Development Interim Committee in the House. So we've been active in trying to disseminate this information. And in fact, even though the release of the report came at the end of the year last year, we've already had certain legislators working with us to pick up ideas around workforce development, recruitment of retention of skilled labor into the state that are sponsoring bills right now going through the session. So we've already seen folks who are interested in the report and the findings and developing policy to support it.
All right. Well, it's good to know it's getting into policymakers' hands, and maybe later on in the podcast we'll talk about whether that's impacting any votes or legislation in Santa Fe, because my impression so far is we're not seeing a lot of real interest in diversifying our economy and enacting pro-business policies. But Ted, kind of let's boil it down here. You've done a lot of work in this report, really looking at New Mexico and its economy. I don't get the impression that you've spent much time here. What did you learn about New Mexico, or what are your impressions of New Mexico and its economy based on the data you discovered?
Yeah, so 2020 was not a great year for spending a lot of time in places. I would have spent a little bit more there. I think that when people start looking at competitiveness, businesses or even individuals who are looking at moving somewhere, data analytics is what they do these days. They take a look. Even if you were deciding where you wanted to go on vacation, you would look at how people judge the VRBO that you were looking at. You would look at what the school system was at a place you would move. Well, businesses look at a lot of factors also. So that's what we start with, as we look at states and cities, metro areas around the country. We look at how they compare to each other. And we look at the three areas that business pay the most attention to, which is business climate. That's everything from tax climate to regulatory climate to legal climate. Infrastructure. And that's everything from roads and railroads and airports and buildings and sites and broadband and you name it. And then the final area, and the one that's the most important these days, is workforce. Am I going to be able to get enough people with the right skills in the areas I need? And so we look at data and hundreds of individual factors, try to build indices that group that data together and then compare them. So that's how we started in New Mexico. We started looking at both how you compared and then also how you've been doing, how your economy looks. And that's everything from, is your unemployment rate good? Have you been adding jobs? But also things like, is your GDP per capita going up? Because that's correlated with wage growth and standard of living. And we look at a lot of those kind of factors. We looked at how you're doing in different industries. Are you growing in industries that are projected to grow? Or are you shrinking in that? Are you growing in industries that you have a competitive advantage in? And we put all of that data together and come up with a series of conclusions that we share with Rob and that big team. Took their advice as to what that really meant inside New Mexico. You're unique. You have oil and gas that's different from a lot of places. You have state funds that are different than other places, but you also have growth in technology sectors that are different. You have outdoor recreation that is different. And we looked at this also in the context of how COVID might be changing competitiveness. Put all that together, then came up with a couple challenges, I think 8 or 9 things that the state needed to work on to improve the competitiveness, and then a whole series of things that might be something the state would want to do to try to address those things. The 2 big challenges are simply that competitiveness as it relates to workforce and business climate especially, but also some infrastructure needs some improvement. And then the big second challenge is that over time, you face an issue that a lot of America faces, which is your working age population isn't projected to grow. And if you're a company looking at the need for workforce going forward, you need to be able to move, you're going to move to a place where you think those workers are going to be available. And some of that's a whole lot of factors. That's everything from having the right skill sets to attracting new people to move there to retaining the military. It's a lot of different factors, but those are the two overall challenges, and the recommendations were set up to try to address those challenges.
Now, a lot of this is based on what you would call survey data and, that kind of real world talking to business leaders and people making decisions about where to locate. Were you able to talk to them about kind of comparing New Mexico versus our neighbors? Because, we at the Rio Grande Foundation, we do a lot of similar work, mostly focusing on data as opposed to talking to business leaders. And, we certainly have different problems and challenges and benefits than our neighboring states. But when you talk about Texas and Colorado and Utah and Arizona, all of them are really growing so much more quickly. And that includes, generally speaking, younger people. I mean, Arizona may have an aged population because it's such a retirement destination, but they have a healthy and growing population, whereas New Mexico has not been growing so fast in recent years.
Yeah, our data would suggest that that's exactly correct. Not only is your population and your working age population not growing as fast, but your gross domestic product per capita is not growing as fast. Your growth in high growth industries isn't as fast. So all of those challenges would have been raised by the data we had. Then we went and talked to people. So most of our work begins with data, and then the focus groups and the survey start asking the qualitative questions. So we would think you would have trouble finding workers. We asked people, they told us they have trouble finding workers. We would think that based on national ratings that there would be some concerns with regulatory environment. We asked, the answer was, yeah, that was the number one issue that businesses came back with. So if you do data regularly like we do, data in and of itself is interesting, but until you put it out there, then you don't know the full picture. Now, I would say one of the sad things is that a lot of people never get past the data nationally, because I spent 30 years as an economic development director, and when you do site selection, the goal is to eliminate people. So you create a funnel, and you say, well, everybody who doesn't meet this data set, we're going to throw out. So we're not going to consider New Mexico because they don't have this percentage or they don't have this growth. And so the data becomes really important. But the other thing that matters is the brand or the image that a state has. Because when you ask people how they make decisions and how they get their information, they get it from data analytics, but they also get it from talking to other business people or other peers if we're talking about an individual. So you meld those two together to try to get an idea of how people are going to look at a place. And when we look at New Mexico, I think a lot of things are positive. Your growth in technology jobs is positive. Your natural beauty is positive. Your tax ratings aren't they're better than the middle. So there are positives to build on. Then the question becomes, all right, here are my negatives. Here are my positives. What can I do to enhance the positives and sell them and try to shore up the negatives? And those are the type of recommendations the report has for Rob and his team to, unfortunately spend years trying to move the needle forward.
Yeah, you have a full discussion of various factors in New Mexico's economy, the business climate. You definitely talk extensively about the working age population.
Yep.
So if you were to, generally address that workforce issue, we at the Rio Grande Foundation spend a lot of time talking about education reform and the need to make our K-12 system more effective at increasing, student outcomes, preparing our young people for whether it's higher education or the workforce. We have concerns about higher education as well, mostly deriving from what we believe is a very high cost structure in higher education. Of course, you can import people as well. And, the nice thing about New Mexico, as opposed to, say, Illinois or Maine, is we have a weather pattern that really works in our benefit. So what do you and your data say about the best way to grow that qualified workforce? I know it's probably some combination of those three or even more, but talk about that.
Yeah, it is. Last year, I spent a lot of time in Wisconsin. And people in Wisconsin say that they can't grow because it's cold. But there are parts of Wisconsin that are growing, and they spend a lot of time there aligning what's going on in their high schools with what's going on in their communities. They're preparing kids, they're rooting kids to be able to have the jobs that are available to them. So if you're in Oshkosh or Green Bay or somewhere, then there are jobs that are available that are good jobs, and they want to make sure the kids have opportunities in school for those kind of things. In New Mexico, you have jobs that are across the spectrum, everything from oil and gas jobs to technology jobs to outdoor recreation jobs. So kids in high school should get a great education. I mean, we all think that you should learn the basics, but you should also learn as much as you can about what the world of work is going to require of you. And you should be exposed to as many things as possible. So we're big fans of high school internships. If you get to college, of college apprenticeships. We want you to see what it's like in the business world and to root you in those things. So there's a bunch of things around that are recommendations. There are programs around the country. I know, Rob, you like the Be Pro, Be Proud program that's in Arkansas and South Carolina. You might want to talk about that. But we made some of those suggestions of people who are being successful with that.
Oh, and I think if I could just to that, I think you're right in the education piece, and improving those outcomes are really, really important. And that's and we also are looking at continuing technical education and that role it plays. But that gets to Ted's point of really aligning that into a workforce or into the labor market, helping kids visualize kind of that career path, and then aligning it with our community colleges and the certification programs, so that you have this ability to kind of say, here's my pathway to a career that's good paying and I can take care of my family. That's maybe very different than what other people in my community or my family have done in the past. And we think there's a program, as Ted mentioned, out of Arkansas called Be Pro, Be Proud, that does a really good job of that. We think it's a good model for New Mexico. It's also been adopted in Georgia and South Carolina. So we're looking at some of those types of programs to really take those kids who maybe not on the four-year pathway, but could go into a certification program, into a trades, into skill sets that really provide a good living for their family and economic security. So those are some of the efforts we want to do with our kids here. But then there's other models. If you look at Oklahoma, they have some really good incentives towards aerospace engineers. They're very targeted in key sectors that they want to grow. So I think as we think about how do we recruit and retain individuals into the state, I think it's really looking at how do we align that with where we want to grow the economy and diversify the economy, and do that in a intentional way, as opposed to, well, we hope somebody shows up.
So I'm going to push back a little bit against both of you on this. Not that I think you are going in the wrong direction, but that you're not going fast enough and hard enough in the right direction, which is, we have an abject failure of our education system in New Mexico at all levels, specifically K-12. We're right now, obviously, at APS, Albuquerque Public Schools, not getting kids in the classroom. PED, the public education department, is defending the whole virtual learning process, saying that it's working just fine. It's like the ship's captain on the Titanic saying everything's going great as the ship breaks apart. I mean, I think we need a more fundamental approach to addressing our education situation in New Mexico than a few programs that will be geared towards already relatively highly motivated and educated students. We need a system, and you talk about crime in the report. Clearly, crime and education issues are at very least somewhat related. Is that what we're looking at? And I'm sorry to be so direct here, but I think Rob especially knows where we at the Rio Grande Foundation stand on education. And it's a very entrenched and difficult challenge. I'm not saying this is easy, but we really need to take this thing at a very fundamental level.
Paul, you're right. I mean, right now, our fourth graders read at the lowest rate or level of any other state in the country. It's absolutely unacceptable. And when you look at the legislature today, I think there's one or two bills that are really focused on that, right? I mean, there's extended learning, but that won't kick in until next year. I mean, we have some fundamental problems with our educational system and how they're preparing students across the state to be able to participate effectively and equally in our economy. And when you think about, you know, we hear a lot about equality in the state, and we should. But what we also need to think about is the equality of how our kids get educated and the access to jobs they have as the kids in Arizona and the kids in Colorado, because our kids do not have equal access to those resources. And until our state starts to prioritize getting kids that level of educational opportunity and then focus on outcomes as opposed to process, we're going to have a very difficult time getting those kids into the workforce. So I don't disagree with you, and I share your urgency there, but that wasn't the focus of the report.
Fair enough. Yeah, no, I get it. Yeah, I bet your workforce development is a big issue, and it's you know, the challenge is multifaceted. So Ted, and thank you for that, Rob. I really appreciate those kid comments. Ted, you know, talking to New Mexico's leaders at this point, if you were to try to improve our workforce, understanding that education is a long-term proposition, even if you got what Rob and I, you know, really, really would like to see at the K-12 level, it's going to take some time to get the results that we want, because, you know, it takes time for kids to grow up. Talk about how you get those workers right now. You know, is it a matter of just going out and attracting more of them and better, you know, skilled workers to New Mexico? And how do you do that?
So first, let me agree with you that if you did the data analysis, that the quality of education would be correlated with poverty rates, crime rates, and workforce preparedness, and that's absolutely true. So you start with education, but as Rob said, he didn't want us to spend too much time on education because there are a lot of other people working on that. I think the challenge when you're talking to a business community about education is that if we start today in pre-K, where you need to start, then it's 20 years before the worker pops out the other end. Mm-hmm. And it's a really hard thing to sustain. And I always tell people that that's where you ought to start, and that's where the data says and the research says you should start. But that's a long-term play, and states who have spent a lot of time on education see the results, but they see it a generation later. You should do it. It's a generational thing. The short run is, how do you get people that are in middle school forward, both the student and the parent, to recognize what the opportunities are going to be and prepare for them, one, and then also, how do you attract into the state? I think you are actually better situated to bring younger people into the state than a lot of places. You are affordable, which is a big deal these days. Your natural beauty, especially your outdoor natural beauty, is spectacular. You're growing in technology fields that might offer that type of opportunity. So trying to attract the people that are in targeted industries where you have a possibility to grow is part of this. And Rob mentioned the program in Oklahoma. There are a lot of states that have decided, well, we're gonna incent people to come to our state, and we're gonna, everything from Vermont incenting you to come if you have a remote job somewhere else, just to come live there because they need to grow, to something really targeted like Oklahoma's program or other programs. Kansas has one for rural parts of Kansas. So there are programs to bring people in, but it ought to be a combination. I mean, you don't want to just give up on everybody that lives in New Mexico and say, let's just bring more qualified people from the outside in. You want people in New Mexico to be able to have the jobs that are good jobs in the state. Part of this, though, goes to that fact that you also want to grow more good jobs. And to do that, you have to compete, unfortunately, as you mentioned, with Texas and Utah and Colorado and Arizona, which are doing pretty good jobs. They're pretty competitive. And so as we would say, the neighborhood has gotten pretty competitive, and you now have to compete in that. There was a time a few years back when South Carolina found itself in a similar spot. North Carolina was growing, Georgia was growing, Tennessee was growing. South Carolina wasn't. They spent a lot of time, especially with their technical schools and apprenticeships, really focused on getting people ready. And after that, their aerospace industry grew, their auto industry grew. It'll be different in New Mexico, but they found a way to be attractive for new and better jobs by focusing on the skills of the workers. And that's a good place to look, because 20 years ago, you wouldn't have thought of South Carolina as a leader. And now the upstate, the Greenville area, the Charleston area are both leaders in new advancing technologies. And they did that focusing on workforce and focusing on the business climate of the state.
Okay, thank you for that, Ted. And kind of drilling down like that a little bit in New Mexico, I'm looking at your challenge 2, which is specifically deals with the working age population, but you've got a fascinating map there, 5-year population growth 2014 to 2019. And the green, you have population growing, red, you have population declining. You've got pretty much a sea of red with a handful of counties. I don't include Catron County. I mean, Catron County is a fine county. We're talking about a population in the hundreds. Either way, it's not going to make it too much of a difference. But Sandoval, Bernalillo, Valencia, and Santa Fe, Los Alamos are all growing. And then down south, you have Doña Ana, Otero, and Eddy counties all growing. And granted, to be fair, those are the highest population places, generally speaking, in the state. There are obviously population centers in Lee County, Chavez County, San Juan County, et cetera, to name a few. But you've got a lot of rural areas throughout New Mexico that are losing population, or in some cases hemorrhaging population. Is this going to be a urban rural situation where the urban areas continue to grow and expand and the rural areas tend to further lose out? Or is there geographical equity, I guess, internal to New Mexico, something we can do to change that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's also the challenge of the country. It's a political challenge. It's an economic challenge. It is a challenge that's accelerating. If we did maps of any state in the country, the urban areas would be growing faster than the rural areas. And we mask that because the suburban or exurban areas near the cores are growing. And then we tell everybody, well, see, the rural areas are growing. Well, they're not rural for very long. So across the country, we've seen this happen. And the places that have tried hard to stem that are places that have focused on helping those rural areas be more competitive. So they've helped them with their education systems, their health systems, their housing, which has become a big issue because rural areas don't have new housing, and people moving these days want newer type housing. But they've also helped them with buildings and sites, broadband expansion, having access to railroads and things like that. So unless we make an effort to make rural areas competitive in states, then what you described will happen. They will become less competitive. People will eventually move out, and you'll be hemorrhaging population. That's what's been happening over about the last 20 years. There's a lot of people who want to try to change that. And you can make a decision as a state. It's a public policy decision whether you want more equitable growth. And if you want more equitable growth, then you have to do more investment, more disproportionate investment into those rural areas. But that's a state decision, but it is something that's happened all over the country. And that's because what it takes to be competitive in those areas has changed. Given 2020, you've got to have broadband, high speed. And if you don't, then business can't be successful. If you want to attract young people into your workforce, you're going to have schools that work, housing that works, healthcare systems that are available. All of those things are there. So that's, again, a decision that a state has to make, but left to its own devices, the inertia today would suggest that rural areas are going to continue to lose young people. And then over time, they've been propped up a little bit because people are living longer. But over time, as that next generation, that older generation moves on, then you're going to see this even get more acute.
Anything to add to that, Rob?
Well, I think Ted's right. I think there's some areas where in New Mexico, looking at our outdoor economy, thinking about places like San Juan, Silver City, those are areas where you could, as you think about diversifying, build, those sorts of targeted investments. One of the areas that we had one of our focus groups on was value-added agriculture. How do we create, that sort of manufacturing, those sort of other processes in state that we've lost. I mean, we don't even think we have a grain silo left in New Mexico that's operating. And, we've just lost a lot of that infrastructure to be able to do on the agricultural side. So again, that's thinking about how do we do those targeted investments. If we're committed to that, it's going to require us thinking about that level of infrastructure and building that back up or creating it.
Okay. Good. Well, we're moving into the recommendations list, and the first three are skilled workers, and we kind of addressed that a little bit. You did talk about the regulatory environment, and for either of you, what does New Mexico need to do? Give us a few specifically to address in the regulatory environment to make us more competitive with other states.
Ted, do you want to start or do you want me to start?
I think I'll let you start and then I'll jump in.
All right. So I think one of the biggest things, and we heard this from our businesses across the state and the focus groups, is really the regulatory environment in New Mexico makes it very difficult to grow or expand your business or to build a business here. And part of it is legislators or others will say, well, tell us what regs are bad and we'll fix it. And it's not just one regulation. It's the overlapping, conflicting challenge of multiple regulations that prevent the ease of capital being deployed in this state. And so we would like to see an approach similar to what was happened in Arizona, where every 5 years, every department reviews their regulations to look for conflicts, inefficiencies, with the idea of reducing and making those regulations more efficient. And they've seen tremendous success in improving business processes there. A similar model in Virginia was passed under a Democratic governor and in a bipartisan legislature to look at 3 different pilots within 3 different departments to do this sort of work as well. Again, they've seen great improvement and kind of identifying those roadblocks and barriers to growth. We would like to see the governor create the governor's Department of Regulatory Reform or Review, and a system set up where we are regularly looking at the regulatory systems in different industries over the course of years, so that we're focused on not getting rid of regulations that are working, but to get rid of things that aren't working well or inefficient, so that we can maintain that we're protecting the environment, we're protecting the residents of the state, but we're also doing it in a way that's much more efficient. So I think that would be a really strong step in the right direction, both as a signal to the business community at large around the country. We're serious about becoming more business friendly, improving our regulatory environment, but also in practicality, identifying those systems that need to be reformed.
I just offer, Paul, that this is not one of those where data helps you very much. There are people who write very complex regulations in 50 words, and then there are other people who write clearer ones in 500 words. And so just measuring how many regulations there are or how many words are in regulations, those kind of things doesn't help very much. But it was clear from the focus groups, and especially from the about 700 businesses that filled out the survey, that this was an area that people wanted somebody to look at, that they were frustrated by it. And nobody was saying particularly that regulation need to be, we need to have regulations that are less stringent. They were talking mostly about regulations that were complicated, conflicting, that were built on top of each other. And that's not anybody's goal when they start out with a regulation. They want to use regulation to protect or to encourage or whatever. But if you do them over and over and over from one session to the next session to the next session, then at some point you have to sort of comb it out. It's a little bit like cleaning out your closet. Everything you put in there, you meant to put in there in the first place. But after a while, you need to go in and clean out so you can find something and it makes sense to you. And I think that was the message we got from the business community, is that an office in the governor's office, or at least an effort by someone to go through and just see what doesn't work anymore or what conflicts, would really help.
Now, Governor Susana Martinez, towards the very end of her administration, did something on occupational licensure, where she offered a executive order trying to, peel back a little bit on the regulation of those folks trying to get into some of those regulated professions. We've at the Rio Grande Foundation, I know, Rob, your organization has worked on right to work to try to make New Mexico a right to work state. And we've also ranted about the gross receipts tax, Davis-Bacon laws. Are those yes, yes, yes? Are they, and I know some of them are challenging, even liquor licenses, which is on the table right now in this session, which maybe we'll get some positive momentum on. So I don't want to say that there's nothing positive happening right now, but I really like specific issues in trying to put those out there on the table.
Well, I mean, I think it's good to do that, but I think we're trying to think of broader systems and how we think about the reform piece. So in a broader strategic way, as opposed to kind of those tactical pieces of this particular thing. And an example is broadband, right? So if you gave me $1 billion today to fix broadband in the state, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it at any time soon, because broadband is regulated by the FCC and the feds. And then it's regulated by the PRC. And then if you need a right of way, you're going to have to deal with the Department of Transportation and the county and the city and the tribal government, all of which individually may be able to easily do, but overlapped, that system breaks down. And so I think that's the type of approach we need to be thinking about across New Mexico government. Is there's a variety of these structures that don't allow us to get the inertia going in the right direction and just roadblock us. So it takes us years to get something done in New Mexico that in Texas might take 6 weeks. And that's where we really have to, I think, on a system level, start to think about things differently.
All right. Well, we just have a few minutes left, and I want to thank both of you for your willingness to hop on the podcast and share some of your thoughts. But I'll give you each a couple minutes to kind of conclude where you want to take the discussion and how people who might be interested in listening to the podcast might be able to engage. So Ted, you first.
So for me, first is that in order to be competitive, you have to continue to monitor it. You ought to build that dashboard and watch it and see what everybody around you is doing, because things do get more competitive. But you also have to be local. We gave a lot of examples of places and programs that are working somewhere else. But New Mexico has to find their own way. They have to find what works in New Mexico. You're going to be competitive if your business climate is good, you have workers, and your infrastructure is solid. And the fourth thing that falls in there are that somebody has a new idea, that you have innovation and entrepreneurship. That's always sort of the fourth leg. I wish it was as simple as saying, here are 3 things to fix. But as you probably know, Paul, since you focus on this, it's easy to say fix public education. It's pretty hard to figure out exactly what to do and how to get everything aligned. So this doesn't get easy, but if you keep watching, the data is there and people are looking at it, so you should too. And I'm going to hopefully keep working with Rob on trying to make sure that everybody has the data that other people are looking at, comparing you, and with a little luck, New Mexico makes progress to try to be a little more competitive in some of those areas.
All right, Rob, take us home.
Paul, I think you talked about, the education issue and this idea of, I think, creating an equality of opportunity for New Mexico kids, both in a rural environment and in an urban environment, whether it's in our education systems or the career opportunities that they have. The equality, of opportunity with what our kids in Arizona get, kids in Colorado, our kids aren't there yet. And we have a lot of work to do. And I want our leaders in Santa Fe to be focused on creating those career opportunities that our neighbor states have for their kids, that we're doing that here in this state. And if there's legislation that's being put forward, there's regulations that are being put forward that don't further that goal, we shouldn't be doing it. Because if we don't do that now, if we don't make those investments now, we're going to condemn the next generation of New Mexicans to poverty. And that's not what we need to be doing. We need to be focused on creating those opportunities in education and in careers here in New Mexico. Anything else is a distraction from that effort. And we've got a limited amount of time to do it. I think if we think about oil and gas and where the revenues are going to be in the next 10 years, we need to make those investments and those changes now. We need to have an urgency about that change. And so that's where we're focused at the state chamber. This is Ted's report. The report we did is the first step in that, but it is a multi-year process of really trying to get the state on track to create those opportunities for our kids.
All right, Rob Black and Ted Abernathy, thank you very much for your time and coming on Tipping Point, New Mexico. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at Tipping Point, New Mexico at tippingpointnewmexico.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, and have your Google Home play Tipping Point, New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show. Yikes.